Afternoon, everyone. I'm Thomas Murray Dawson with Center for Political Education, and I'm joining you from the occupied lands of the Ohlone people in the East Bay of California. It's great to have you back with us this week. We encourage everyone to pay their Shoot Me land tax if you're here in the Bay Area, and you can do that by following the link in the chat. As usual, the chat's going to be disabled for these calls, except for us to share information with you all. And if you have questions you'd like to get answered during the call, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll try to answer them during the call, if not in our follow-up email. In that same toolbar at the bottom of your screen, you can find the CC button, which will enable closed captioning. And we're also grateful to have ASL interpreters with us throughout this call. On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join us in ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area. If you're returning, thanks for sticking with us through these many weeks, and please share these calls with your comrades, colleagues, and friends. As usual, recordings of these sessions are available on YouTube on CPE's YouTube channel. This week, on Wednesday, June 5th, marked Nakba Day, the annual commemoration of the forced displacement of over 300,000 Palestinians following the Six-Day War, in which Israel expanded its territory and began its now 57-year-long occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. It took place just 19 years after the Nakba, in which more than 750,000 Palestinians had become refugees in their homeland. The Nakba was a culmination of the first colonial barbarism of the Nakba and set the ground for the current genocide we are witnessing today. There have been no shortage of major developments since we last spoke, including developments at the ICJ, more mass graves and war crimes in Gaza, and powerful actions of solidarity across the globe, including this week in San Francisco at the Israeli consulate, all of which show the growing consensus among the global public against Israel and the United States in this fanatical genocidal war. Several months ago, we spoke about the legal case that was brought by Palestinian families against the Biden administration for its complicity in this genocide, and we'll hear an important update on that case today, And I just want to share, I'll share my screen again just to walk through our very brief our agenda today. We'll be talking about that case, DCIP v. Biden, which is on appeal, with Asta Sharma Pokhrel from Center for Constitutional Rights. And then, of course, we'll have Samar Arabi from AROC to give us an update on the incredibly fast-moving political developments happening around Gaza and within U.S. domestic and global politics. And then we'll close out with some announcements, important announcements for what's going on next Monday in terms of the DCIP v. Biden case, which will be happening in San Francisco. Arguments will be heard in San Francisco, and there'll be an action outside and other upcoming actions and requests for support. With that, I am going to hand it over to Melissa Fan to start us off with a grounding with sermatics practice.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Colonization is an epistemology. All interlocking systems of oppression produce their own ways of knowing, which dominate and suppress other epistemologies, other ways of knowing. In our somatic practice today, I want to ask us to consider what colonial and oppressive epistemologies we still internalize and perhaps unconsciously reproduce, knowing that all of us who live in the heart of empire are conditioned into colonial ways of knowing since birth. Because part of colonization is a severing of mind from body, spirit, earth, and community. And in this severance, we are conditioned to prioritize cognition over emotions and sensations, logistics over intuition, and the material over the spiritual. And in the internal frontline against the forces of colonization, we have to resist this hierarchy of knowing because there is vital wisdom for liberation in our emotions, in intuition, in spirituality, and in connecting to the earth. All right, so finding yourself in a comfortable position, connecting your feet to the ground if possible, and beginning to just feel the weight of your body in space in this particular time. And noticing here for yourself if even me asking you to connect to your body, to feel the weight of your body, brings up feelings of irritation or annoyance or dissociation. Knowing that all of those are actually very normal feelings to have. And taking a deep breath in, breathing all the way down into your diaphragm. Noticing here the quality of your breath. And what thoughts might race through your mind with slowing down. If your mind immediately starts wandering, or if maybe you even dismiss the invitation to take a deep breath. Inviting in a little bit of curiosity. And from here, finding all of your toes or the lowest extremity that you do have. And bringing some conscious awareness there by wiggling or tapping. And from here, bringing your breath to your heart, maybe putting a hand over your heart. And just saying hello, hello hearts. Hey, it's rough. It's been rough. And our hearts are hurting. And once again here, noticing for yourself, what does it feel like when I ask you to connect to your heart? What thoughts arise? What sensations arise? Noticing without judgment, just being curious. And lastly, just bringing some conscious awareness to your core. Just a little bit below your belly button, maybe putting a hand there if that helps. And breathing all the way down into your belly. Bringing in more curiosity. And inviting each of us into different ways of knowing, different ways of sensing, pre-colonial and decolonial epistemologies, ways of knowing. Thank you for practicing with me today.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Um, let's bring up Asta to talk a little bit more about the case. Asta, welcome. It's great to have you. Just a reminder, Asta is one of these attorneys from CCR who's been working on the DCIP v. Biden case. Um, Asta, it's great to have you. I know that you've been working tirelessly on this the last few months. I wanted to just maybe start by having us recap what happened after the hearing in January, and talking a little bit about the meaning of Judge White's order on January 31st. Specifically, maybe you can help us understand the importance of that, the finding by Judge White that Israel's assault and siege on the Palestinian people in Gaza was plausibly constituting genocide, and the fact that he implored the Biden administration to re-examine its unflagging support for Israel, and also why the case was ultimately dismissed at the lower court level.
Thank you. Thanks, Thomas, and thanks so much, Melissa, for that grounding exercise. So maybe just to back up a little bit, although most of you might know, this case, part of what this case is seeking to do is to stop all support of Israel, all U.S. support of Israel in its genocidal campaign in Gaza, including, and in particular, military support and weapons that Israel is using in Gaza. There are two claims in this case. One is the defendant's duty to prevent genocide. The defendants here are Biden, Blinken, and Austin. They're failing in their duty to prevent genocide. And the other is the claim that they are actually not only failing in their duty to prevent genocide, but actually aiding and abetting the genocide. So there's a complicity claim as well. And as many of you probably know, there was a hearing at the district court on January 26th in the district court in Oakland. And it was a really powerful hearing, and I think in some ways will be important to see, like important to recognize the difference between what that was and what the oral argument on the 10th will be. The hearing at the district court was really powerful. It went on for about 4 hours, and we heard sort of legal argumentation on the case, but then we also heard testimony from our plaintiffs and an expert on genocide and Holocaust studies. And our plaintiffs really put on extremely powerful testimony about the impact of the genocide on them, on their families. We had one of our plaintiffs who at the time was calling from a hospital floor. He's a doctor calling from a hospital floor in Gaza, where he spent 24 hours a day then, to describe in district court, in a federal district court in California, what he was experiencing, and our plaintiffs were able to sort of connect what is happening today to the Nakba and the history of genocide in Palestine. And so the judge ended the hearing that day saying, this is one of the most difficult cases I've ever had to decide factually or legally. Underscored that there was uncontroverted evidence that Israel was committing a genocide. And we were anticipating a ruling fairly quickly. We had an emergency motion that was pending, and so we anticipated that the judge would issue a ruling fairly quickly. And so a few days after the hearing, the court issued its ruling and it dismissed the case. But Thomas, like you said, there were several findings in the opinion that were really significant. I think first, significantly, the court found that based on the evidence that we had presented, that it was plausible that Israel was committing a genocide in Gaza. It also recognized the ICJ's sort of pronouncement on this issue. The ICJ had issued its original provisional measures on the South Africa case on January 26th. That was the same day as our hearing. And so the court kind of recognized what the ICJ had said and underscored it and said, independently, this court also sees based on the uncontroverted evidence that what Israel is doing in Gaza is plausibly a genocide. And I think it's important. I think the significance of that is, I think it's extremely significant to have a U.S. federal court recognize that what Israel is doing is a genocide, and it kind of adds to what the ICJ had already pronounced and or issued in its provisional measures. And so the significance of a federal court, a U.S. federal court, recognizing that what Israel is doing is a genocide is really important to underscore, I think. And I think, I've been thinking about the framework of genocide and why the language, or why the legal concept is important, or is important to recognize. I mean, I think first it's factually describes what is happening in Gaza. But I think also many of us recognize that what Israel has been doing to Palestinians for decades is a slow genocide. And so what is, using the term now, what does it do? And I think it's important to recognize the legal sort of significance of it, and the difference between the legal framework of genocide and the legal frameworks that were sometimes that what Israel is doing in Gaza, in Palestine, is sometimes restricted to, which is international humanitarian law or the laws of war, where the questions often end on or turn on whether something is done for self-defense, whether something is done proportionately. When you're in the context of genocide, these questions are raised, but the answer is you cannot commit a proportional genocide. You cannot commit a genocide in self-defense. And so I think in some ways this legal term helps to expose the reality of what Israel is doing, that it's not motivated by self-defense. It's not motivated by the goal of protecting its people, that it's motivated by the purpose of destroying another people. So I think there's something really important about the legal framework of genocide itself that this raises, and so the federal court's ruling raises too. And then the other thing that the court recognized was that the defendants, the U.S. and the executive in this case, was unflaggingly supporting Israel, and the court implored the defendants to re-examine the results of their unflagging support of the military siege in Gaza. And so again, the significance of this, recognizing that the United States is supporting Israel in the context of a genocide, is a finding that is relevant for U.S. liability for this genocide. Ultimately, the court dismissed the case under what's called the political question doctrine. So this is a doctrine that recognizes that there are certain questions that a court should leave up to the executive. So it's a doctrine that comes out of this idea of the separation of powers, that the executive, the legislature, and the courts have different roles. The judiciary, they have different roles, and that they should not interfere in each other's roles. So based on the political question doctrine, this court determined that generally matters of foreign policy should be left up to the executive. This is something that we're challenging in the Court of Appeals. There was a fairly broad ruling that generally matters of foreign policy should be left up to the executive. So in this case, this court found that even in the claim of genocide, even when it was not the preferred outcome of the court, as it said itself in its ruling, the court said, this is not the court's preferred outcome, but we have to sort of defer to the executive in this context, even when the claim is a plausible case of genocide. So what we saw from the ruling was the use of the political question doctrine, the really broad use of the political question doctrine, really immunizing the executive from liability for anything that could be characterized as a matter of foreign policy, which is extremely broad.
Thanks, Asta. So let's dig into that a little bit more. I mean, I think for folks who may not be as familiar with the doctrines at play here, and also trying to understand what's doable on appeal. I think that it seems to be that there are two questions, and correct me if this is inaccurate, but, one is that whether the court, Judge White was incorrect in saying that as you just mentioned, there is no jurisdiction in providing this kind of relief, namely to stop the Biden administration from preventing and stopping the furthering of this genocide. Under that political question doctrine, right? This deference, or rather full deference, on whether or not this is a matter of foreign policy. So help us explain that, and then also the second thing that you all are asking on appeal is, even notwithstanding that Judge White was also incorrect in not actually making a judgment of whether the Biden administration was violating the law in the first place, right? That the judge should have provided, I think, would be categorized as declaratory relief here. So can you explain a little bit about how those two pieces work a little bit more, and what the arguments that are being made by CCR and the legal team on appeal in support of both, the fact that the interpretation of political question here was overbroad and too deferential to the executive, and then secondarily that the lower court should have actually made a judgment about, whether or not the Biden administration is violating customary international law and U.S. statutory law, based on its current support of Israel in this genocide.
Yeah, so it's actually, it is true that I think the main issue on appeal is this jurisdictional issue about the political question doctrine. There's also another jurisdictional issue that I can talk about, which is standing, which I can explain in a moment. And the piece about Judge White should have actually answered this question flows from our argument that the court improperly ruled that it didn't have jurisdiction. So if it had properly ruled that it had jurisdiction over the case, it would have had to answer these questions about whether the U.S. is liable in its failure to prevent and its complicity in the genocide. So I think the first issue is the political question issue. And that is, like I said, that defendants have argued in the court, and the lower court accepted, that when what you are raising is a matter of foreign policy, that all of that should be left up to the executive. But the political question doctrine is actually a much narrower analysis than that. It is not a sort of framework where you say, okay, all matters of foreign policy are entirely left up to the executive. It's intended to be, and the Supreme Court has reiterated that it is a discriminating doctrine. There's a framework in which you have to examine what exactly is the question that the court is supposed to answer here, and is that question actually left up to the executive by the Constitution? And so in determining whether a political question is implicated in this case, the two main questions that the court should have examined and answered is whether what the questions were in the first instance to begin with, and then whether those questions are committed to a branch of government. And there is nothing in the Constitution that commits foreign policy writ large to the executive. That is one of the arguments that we've been that you can read in our briefs to the Ninth Circuit. And then the second question is the second really big question that the court should have asked itself, was whether there are judicially manageable standards to examine the question at issue. So there might be, in some cases, you have questions that a court really doesn't have the tools to answer, whereas in this case, the court has the tools to answer whether there's an unfolding genocide or a risk of it, or a serious risk of it, and and whether the defendants in this case have failed to prevent it, and whether they have aided and abetted it. These are questions that a court is very well equipped to answer, because that's what courts do. Courts look at the facts and apply a lot of the facts, and they do it. And courts internationally have examined the question of genocide, and courts often examine the question of aiding and abetting liability. So these are not questions that a court doesn't have the tool to answer. These are questions that courts are very equipped at answering, and have engaged with historically. And so the district court had what's called judicially manageable standards to engage with the question. There's other factors that go into the political question doctrine analysis, but those two are the main ones, are the most important ones. And the court, instead of sort of doing a discriminating analysis of what are the questions at issue here, kind of said it's a matter of foreign, it looks like a matter of foreign policy, and so I'm not going to engage with it. And so that's one of the main issues that, if you are able to listen in on the argument, either in person or online, you'll hear about on Monday. And so the second issue that the defendants have raised, which again you'll hear about on Monday, is this issue of standing. So they had raised this issue in the lower court, but the district court did not rule on it. And so standing is a requirement that if you are going to bring a case to court, in this case to federal court, the plaintiffs who are bringing the case have to be injured. They have to have some sort of injury, not physical, but some sort of, they have to be harmed in some way, and that harm needs to be caused by in some way, and caused by the defendant in the case, and redressable by the court. And so what defendants have argued in this case, and what again, the district court judge did not rule on this, but they've raised it again on appeal, is that these plaintiffs can't bring these claims against the Biden administration, because the actions that they are injured by, the actions that they are harmed by, are Israel's independent actions, and the US has nothing to do with it. And I think, again, to many on this call, this argument is laughable, given the fact that the US and Biden has admitted, not only has there been reporting that US weapons have been used extensively in Gaza, that the majority of weapons used by Israel in Gaza are US supplied, but just a couple of weeks ago, Biden admitted that US sourced bombs had been used in Gaza. So in some ways, this argument is factually just kind of incorrect and shocking. And I think in some ways, it's also contradictory with their political question doctrine argument. Under their political question doctrine argument, they have said, if you have a chance to read their briefing in the Ninth Circuit, they've said, the US commitment to Israel's what's called qualitative military edge, so ensuring that Israel is a strong military in the region, has been the policy of the United States, and continues to be the policy of the United States, even in the face of genocide. So they've said that in the context of the political question doctrine. But then in their standing argument, they've said, well, we have nothing to do with the fact that Israel is using that military capacity to commit a genocide. So there's a bit of a contradiction in what you might hear in the argument too. And then another issue that they've raised under the standing doctrine has been that the court cannot redress plaintiffs' harms, not only because the defendants are essentially immune because of the political question doctrine, but also because the president himself is generally immune from these types of cases. And so our response to that is that when you have a clear violation of law, the president is not immune. We've seen this in other cases against both President Biden and President Trump. The Muslim ban case, for example, was one where Many of you probably know the executive's action, the president's actions were challenged, and there was not an issue of immunity there. So those are some of the arguments that you can expect to hear on Monday. It's likely the political question doctrine will take up most of the time, but.
Thanks, Asta. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that there's some real testing of the judicial system, both here in the federal system and the international system, in terms of their ability to um, be effective at all when we're dealing with the crime of crimes, which is genocide. And so, as you've mentioned numerous times, I think for folks that are outside of the legal system, exasperating kind of moments, kind of hearing these arguments and disbelief, right, at the inability of these legal systems to move not only effectively but efficiently and quickly when so much harm is happening. Before you go, I wanted to just ask a couple more questions that I think will help folks who may be turning out for the actions on Monday have a little bit more of an understanding of what's going down. Specifically, just, what is the difference on appeal? What should folks expect in terms of, now that this will be a hearing in front of a panel of judges? And, it was also noted this week that a motion was made to have one of the judges recused from the hearing, and that judge actually ultimately did recuse, even though I think Judge Nolan, I believe that's his name, didn't actually agree with the claims that were being made in that request. But also just an understanding of like what to expect that might be different from for those who attended the last action in terms of the hearing, what will be the focus of and the dynamics at play, and then maybe even the timing of a decision subsequent to the hearing on Monday.
Yeah, so I think the hearing at the Court of Appeals will be very different from what we saw at the district court. I think for one, at the district court, there was this the fact that there was testimony, the fact that there were hours of testimony, I think will be very different. At the Court of Appeals, what you will see is just oral arguments from the two sides. So one attorney from each side will be presenting the legal arguments and answering the judge's questions. There won't be testimony from plaintiffs or from experts or anything like that. It will be a 3-panel judge, and they'll each be engaging with the argument in whatever way they choose to. The motion to recuse, yes. So once the panel was assigned, we discovered that one of the judges had gone on a trip that was organized by the World Jewish Congress to Israel in March, where reports, indicated that they had met with the Israeli government and judicial officials and members of the IDF, the IOF, the Israeli Defense Forces. And we felt it was our legal obligation to alert the court and let the court decide what to do, whether it was important for this judge to recuse himself or not. And I think the court recognized the importance of impartiality, and at the very least, the appearance of impartiality, and recused himself. And so immediately after that happened, another judge was appointed, Judge Callahan, to replace him. So the panel will be a 3-judge panel, not including Judge Nelson. And right, it'll be different from the district court.
And Asta, just one more thing, before you go, I think a lot has happened actually since this case was initially filed, and obviously even in the interim since the January 31st order came from Judge White, or decision came from Judge White. And so I think for folks who have been, keeping close track and working on this, and given the scale and magnitude of developments that have happened, including the skyrocketing death toll and some of what's gone on in the international legal system, is there any bearing that some of these developments have on the case that might come into play at this stage in the appeal, or is it still very much narrowly focused on these questions of jurisdiction and standing that you've already mentioned?
So the argument itself will be fairly narrowly focused on these two questions, but I think it's important to recognize how the changes in what's happening, the escalation of what's happening, impacts these issues. I think on the issue of standing and the question of whether the United States has contributed to this, has aided and abetted this genocide, I think increasingly it's become clear that that is the case. Like I said, Biden, recently has recognized that U.S. bombs have been used in Gaza, and Biden himself sort of claimed there was a red line that Israel could cross through its actions in Rafah, and apparently that hasn't happened yet, despite what Israel has been doing in Rafah, and the ICJ's recognition of the gravity of what Israel has been doing in Rafah. So I think these factual developments underscore how untenable the defendant's argument related to standing is. And I think all of these developments also underscore the importance of ensuring that the political question doctrine remains what is a discriminating and narrow doctrine, that it doesn't allow for immunity of the crime of crimes. As things escalate, get worse, the death tolls increase, it becomes increasingly untenable again to say that the executive should have free rein as long as it determines that it's its foreign policy to support a genocidal state, that the executive should have free rein to do whatever it wants. I think as things continue, it becomes increasingly important to make sure that these doctrines serve their purpose, which is to ensure the separation of powers, and make sure that the judiciary is only intervening where it needs to and where it has, the responsibility and authority to, but that they're not kind of expanded to become doctrines of immunity on issues that we expect some accountability on.
Asta Shamra Pokorel, thank you so much for joining us again and for all your work on this case. We'll be out there supporting you and the legal team on Monday, and wish you all the best of luck in your arguments before the Court of Appeals.
Thanks so much, Thomas, and thank you for everyone who's able to tune in and support.
All right, y'all. So in our remaining time, we want to bring up Samar Arabi from Iraq. Samar, I know that there's way more to cover than there is time that we have allotted. And so I'm going to give you a pre-congratulations on being able to get through it. But let me hand it over to you so you can dive right in.
Great. Thanks so much, Thomas. It's great to be here. And yeah, there is a lot, so I will just jump right in. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So much. Just getting right into the Rafah offensive, which obviously has been ongoing and pretty horrifically expanding over the past couple of weeks. I think folks have seen a lot of the news that has come out of that. Yeah, I wanted to take a moment just to reflect on something that the UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese said this past week about how, recognizing the idea that Israel won't stop this madness until we make it stop, and calling on all UN member states to impose sanctions and arms embargoes until Israel stops its assault. The worst things I think that have happened that people have heard about these past couple of weeks have been these refugee camp bombings and school bombings, which I think folks have probably heard a lot about. So I don't think I need to get into the nitty-gritty of all the horrific ways that these civilian evacuation centers have been attacked with U.S. munitions. I think a key thing that's come out this past week about a lot of this stuff is that the investigations conducted by U.S. U.S. media outfits have confirmed that it was U.S. bombs that were dropped both on the refugee camps and on the school that led to all of these civilian deaths. So that's a pretty powerful way tying in U.S. complicity directly into the slaughter of civilians. That is exactly what the world has been worrying would happen as Israel scaled up this Rafah assault. And so we are seeing the sort of nightmare scenario play out in real time now. And, Asha talked about this briefly, but, this idea of Biden's red line, which has just been laughably ignored. I don't know if folks saw this. There were a couple of remarkable press conferences in the past week, including one where the CBS reporter asked how many more charred corpses Biden has to see before he considers a change in policy. And when you hear that from CBS, you understand that there's sort of like a serious vibe shift happening. And just to say that the way that the Biden administration has tried to ignore this red line problem is that they've said that they haven't actually seen a major Rafah offensive. And the key piece of that, oddly enough, is that they haven't seen it, which is not to say that it's not happening, but that they just haven't acknowledged it yet. They issued that statement literally the same day that there were news reports that tanks were rolling into central Rafah. So it's very clearly just an attempt to like wash away the administration's responsibility here to actually act on the red line that Biden has enforced, which is not to say that it was meaningless. I think it's important for us to understand this red line in terms of where the Biden administration wants this conflict to be progressing and how that cleaves from where Israel and the current ruling Israeli political class is pushing it. And I think that cleavage is something that we're starting to see progressively widen in a way that's important. We'll come back to when we talk about the ceasefire. While the Biden administration is sort of failing to act on this stuff, we saw the ICJ move last week in ordering the offensive to stop, I guess 2 weeks ago. And just today, there was news that the UN is putting Israel on a blacklist of countries that harm children. And so, as you can imagine, the Israeli government is freaking out about this. I would recommend, and I've linked to it in the slides per usual. I would recommend checking out the old reports. This is an annual thing that the UN does every June on a report in children and armed conflict. And just to say that, like, in June of last year, the things that they were saying about Israeli violations and the sort of the murder and the maiming of children has been obviously an ongoing, long-standing issue that didn't start, in these past 8 months, but rather has been something that the UN has been cataloging for many, many years. So I'm curious to see what it'll look like this year now that it's fully in blacklist stage, which the Western media in reporting it is calling Israel the only democracy to be placed on this blacklist, which maybe should encourage some reflection on what that word actually means. And, in the meantime, the humanitarian crisis is something that I feel like folks haven't been talking about a lot lately, but has been getting progressively worse. So from that moment where people were talking about how bad the starvation situation was, aid has been cut in half since then. And so all sort of attempts to open up border crossings or force Israel to allow aid through the existing crossings just have utterly failed. And a big part of that, a small part of that is the U.S. aid pier, which, if folks saw, collapsed entirely last week. It is ostensibly supposed to be rebuilt next week, and there's a lot to say about it, but maybe next week. But just to say that it's non-functioning and it hasn't been functioning, nor have any of the other crossings effectively let in any meaningful amount of aid. So, we're at the point now where, particularly in the South, zero, not a single truck of aid is getting across through southern border crossings. And so the risk of starvation now, the level 5, which is the highest possible categorization of food insecurity, is now over 1 million people and is projected to be significantly higher within the next month. in the context of all of this is the ceasefire deal. And so, uh, it's a mess, as I'm sure all of you all have been grappling with yourselves, like understanding what is even going on here. Whose ceasefire deal is this? And where does it currently stand? So I've done my best to try to disentangle that, but there are a lot of different moving pieces. At its face, I will say, the ceasefire deal that Biden presented to the public last weekend was very similar to the one that was proposed by Hamas in February, the sort of three-phase, immediate cessation of hostilities that leads to a permanent end of the hostilities through a set of prisoner swaps. But we don't actually know the details of the ceasefire proposal. They haven't been, at least to my knowledge, made public. So despite the fact that we know at a high level what the ceasefire deal is calling for, we don't know how the details differ from past proposals. And we don't, we don't know how those individual components are impacting the party's willingness to sort of engage with it. So, I think on some level, Biden's assertion that this was something that came from the Israeli negotiating team is probably true somewhat. I don't think it's very true. And I think it was obviously an attempt to push the Israelis into accepting a deal. But it's increasingly clear that the Israelis won't do it. And the clearest indication of that actually just came yesterday, where Israel said that it would oppose the U.S. resolution, which the U.S. resolution to express support for the Israeli ceasefire proposal. The Israelis say they oppose that resolution, which is sort of brain-breaking in its hypocrisy and contradiction. And, there are a lot of different reasons for this, but a couple of key ones are basically that it's sort of reflecting on this idea of permanently ending the war, which is something that Israel straight up does not want. And apparently there's a clause in the resolution that also, quote, rejects any attempt at demographic or territorial change in the Gaza Strip. And the Israelis are not okay with that either, which I think really speaks to what their sort of long-term plans are in Gaza and how that might impact what they're willing to have their allies say on their behalf. And, just to note, Netanyahu has been signaling very publicly that the ceasefire deal is dead in the water unless it is politically advantageous to him, and that quote, the war won't end until Hamas is dismantled. And I know this is a thing we've talked about a lot, but I do want to just note that everybody knows, including the Israeli, the political class and military, that the idea of dismantling Hamas is a fiction. Just this past week, Israeli assessments of Hamas's ground operations and capabilities shows that they have 10 of their original 24 battalions fully functional, with full command and control capabilities, and then an additional unknown how many that are partially functional. So it's a not dissimilar situation to the US in Iraq, where a battalion would be dismantled, and another time maybe we can go into what the language of dismantling actually means. But once the Israeli military moves in, they sort of destroy an area and then they leave. And as soon as they've left, those battalions reform. So the idea of dismantling Hamas is a fiction. It's not, it's not something that even top Israeli military leaders are saying is possible. So that's obviously not the real reason they're not stopping the war. And even Biden is acknowledging now that Netanyahu is prolonging the war for political reasons. And there's this incredible quote in Time magazine from his interview a few days ago, where he said that the problem with the ceasefire deal is Hamas, and that Hamas could end this tomorrow if they just said unintelligible, is the quote. Which, yeah, that about, I think, properly sums up Biden's understanding of the conflict. And just to say, Hamas's position on this, I think, has been changing in the past few days, and changing might not be the right phrasing here, because when Biden presented that plan publicly, Hamas publicly supported it. But lately, they've been issuing statements saying that they won't agree to anything that doesn't lead to an end of the fighting, like a permanent end. And obviously, this is the main friction point, as it has been. We've talked about so many times between Hamas and Israel, that Israel wants the war to continue, Hamas wants the war to end. And there are sources that say, and this isn't confirmed, but there are sources that say the fight that is happening right now over the ceasefire language is actually in like clause 1, like the first phase of the ceasefire agreement, which, if you remember, is the immediate cessation of hostilities and the release of Palestinian political prisoners and infirm Israeli hostages. But the issue is that the US version of it says that that initial phase is renewable. So like if they can't figure out all the details within 6 weeks to switch to the full cessation of hostilities, to switch to like the longer term end of the war, then that 6-week period renews. And Israel refuses to have a renewable 6-week period. They want it to be a single 6-week period. And if they stall or don't make it through the process, then the war continues as before, which obviously is the thing that Israel has been trying to do, because their ideal scenario is to get hostages released and then go back to bombing Gaza. So it generally takes Hamas a little while to issue an official response to a proposal like this, and they often do it on the weekends, I think. So it's possible we'll hear something in the next 2 days, but unclear. And frankly, I think there was a lot of hope that something was actually going to happen with this deal, but it's looking increasingly less likely. Not impossible. There could be a surprise in the next 3 days, or even, in the next week or so. But I would say the odds are no longer in favor of this ceasefire deal passing right now, which, almost unbelievable that we're still here. And just to say, with the ceasefire not passing through, what do we have on the horizon? The Israeli military is hoping to stay in Gaza at least through the end of the year. It's likely to be longer if they get their way. There's an increasing indication that there might be a large-scale operation in Lebanon, but if that were the case, that won't happen for another month or two, so we don't have to talk about it now. They're clearly building the infrastructure for a long-term military occupation of Gaza, which, may or may not be, would be ideal for the Israelis, but, it's a question of how much pressure can be asserted on them, both in terms of their military losses in Gaza and in terms of international pressure to not do that. And in that context, you're seeing all of this political fragmentation where the unity cabinet in Israel is about to dissolve. Benny Gantz, who is one of the US preferred clients, now that they're trying to push out Netanyahu, said that he's going to resign by Saturday, which is tomorrow. So it's possible that unity coalition government is about to fall in the next 24 hours. Even domestically here, the NAACP called for an end to arming Israel, which is a shocking revelation, and then they withdrew it and then republished it. But a huge blow to the Biden administration from one of its core constituency groups. Again, we could spend all day talking about just the NAACP piece. I won't really talk about the ICJ updates, just to say that, the number of countries that are supporting the South Africa case is now 13, and the Israeli judge has resigned with no planned replacement. So that's really saying something about Israel's withdrawal from that entire arena. I'd really recommend reading this Guardian article about how the Israeli government has been trying to undermine the ICC for a decade, and the sort of horrific racism that underpins a lot of that. So please do read that if you get a chance. This House passed a sanction bill that Biden says he doesn't support, but hasn't said that he would veto. So it's not really clear what's going to come from this. But Democrats, a good number, like 40 Democrats voted for it, even though Biden said he opposed it. And part of that is this revealed Israeli psychological operations campaign where they've been targeting Black lawmakers. You should check out some of these wild legislation bits that have come through. Netanyahu is coming to Congress on July 24th. I think it has been finally confirmed. There have been some amazing actions in the past week that I hope you all had a chance to engage with. And if not, come to the future ones. We've got the court action on Monday, and tomorrow a big action in LA that's supposed to coincide with an even larger one in DC. There are buses that can take you there if you want to go. And then I'll leave you to read the sum up if you want to check out the slides later. And that is it. Check out the calendar if you want to come to future events. Text our number to text PSA to 833-633-0604 if you want to get updates on what's going on. And check out the Pal Media Tracker if you want news articles. Woof. Okay, that's it.
Samer, thank you so much. Before our folks go, Annie just has a couple of announcements that are related to some of the actions, just a little bit more detail, particularly about supporting some of the work that's going into getting folks down to LA tomorrow, and then also some details on Monday. So Annie, without further ado.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks, Samer. Just briefly, so join us on Monday in support of Palestinian plaintiffs in the historic case to charge the U.S. government with complicity in genocide. We'll be outside the federal court for an art build and rally, including hearing from lawyers who have just come outside from appealing their case. So that's next Monday, June 10th, 10 a.m. to noon at the San Francisco Federal Building on 97th Street in San Francisco near the Civic Center BART. And then also there's a call for support for an action happening tomorrow that we'd like to share here. So tomorrow, Saturday, June 8th, the Palestinian Youth Movement is hosting a West Coast Red Line action in Los Angeles in solidarity with the action taking place on the same day in Washington, D.C., where on a day that marks 8 months of U.S.-Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people and the 54th anniversary of the occupation of Gaza, tens of thousands of people will surround the White House to form a red line for Biden. PYM is renting 2 buses to bring folks from the Bay Area down to LA to participate and extend the red line from the East Coast to the West. I'm going to put a link in the chat for those who want to join, and I will also put a Venmo link for folks who can donate to support other comrades to go. Please consider making a donation as the trip is tomorrow, and we're still working on raising all the funds needed to cover the cost of the buses to make this action accessible to as many people as possible and to get as many of our folks out and into the streets. Together, we can help make this happen. If you cannot donate via Venmo but would still like to contribute, you can reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat, and I'll also include a link to Monday's action. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Annie. Thanks, Shantae and Cassandra, staying with us a little bit longer. And thank you all for sticking with us. Again, keep an eye out for the follow-up email to this PSA, and we'll include some of Samer's slides. And if you can, try to roll out for the action on Saturday and definitely the action on Monday afternoon. And with that, thanks for joining us, and we will see you soon.